I recently published a video showing how to make your footage look more cinematic. And it really talked about what to do once it was in your video editing software, how to create a soundscape. And the first question I was asked was, well, that's great, Daniel, but how do we actually film the footage in the first place? So today I thought I'd go through those steps and set up a simple shot and show you how to create something with your camera that looks really cinematic. Let's do this. Let me show you the completed track first, and then we can walk through the steps of how I got that shot set up. All right? Watch this. If you want to learn how to set up a shot just like that yourself, stick around. I'll show you how. I'd like to thank today's sponsor, StreamYard.com, for allowing me to show you these techniques. If you're interested in signing up for a free account at StreamYard and start live streaming today, I'll leave links down in the comments below. So I shot that footage with this camera, which is a Sony a6400 with a Sigma 16mm f1.4 lens. It's not their most expensive camera, and it's certainly not their newest camera, but it does a pretty good job at an affordable price to actually film things that look pretty cinematic. Understanding how to set up your camera to film a shot like this begins with understanding the basics of camera function, which really comes down to the exposure triangle. Let me explain. The exposure triangle is comprised of three different camera or lens settings: the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO. Now, the aperture is the variable opening by which light actually enters your camera. You can set how wide that opens when you film, but what's sometimes confusing is that the smaller the number, the larger the aperture actually is. So in this case, the 1.4 that I was using was actually a pretty large aperture. The shutter speed is a little more obvious. It's the length of time the shutter is actually staying open at any given setting. The ISO, which is kind of a messed up acronym for International Organization of Standardization, controls your camera's sensitivity to light. These three camera and lens controls work together to regulate the amount of light that makes it to your camera's sensor. Now, not only do these three controls affect the amount of light that's coming into your camera, but they each have unique side effects. The aperture controls the depth of field, or more simply put, how sharp or blurry the area around or behind the subject in your shot is. The higher the f-stop, the smaller the opening in the lens becomes and the sharper the background is. Now, shutter speed can blur or freeze the action. A faster shutter speed will give you less blur per frame. And finally, the ISO can add or subtract the amount of film grain or digital noise that your footage might incur. A lower ISO is going to give you a crisper image. Now, the way these interact is a lower f-stop means more light is going to enter through the lens, and therefore the shutter doesn't need to stay open as long to make a correct exposure, which translates into a faster shutter speed. Again, the reverse is true. Using a higher f-stop means that less light is entering the lens, and therefore the shutter will need to stay open a little bit longer, which translates to a slower shutter speed. In this scenario, if you wanted to use a faster shutter speed, you'd have to compensate by using a higher ISO to increase the light sensitivity of your camera and brighten up your shot. Now, understanding that exposure triangle helps make sense of the camera settings I use today. For the purposes of this shot, I wanted a reasonably large aperture setting so that I could get some blur around the main image. Using f1.4 allowed me to keep my ISO fairly low at 320. There's a basic rule of thumb for shooting video as opposed to taking pictures called the 180-degree rule that states whatever you've got your frame rate set at, you should double it to determine your shutter speed. I was using 120 FPS, and this is the closest I could dial into 240. You can see I set our dining room table up with a simple sheet that was ironed smooth on top of it, one single daylight fluorescent bulb on a stand with a diffuser panel over it, and then my camera set fairly low to capture the action. I was thinking I would put coffee beans inside of this cup, but all I had was black beans, so that's what we used. My girlfriend and I played around with spilling those beans across the table and then shoving the coffee mug right back into them. At normal speed, this doesn't look nearly as impressive. Okay, what do you think? Same thing, kind of dump them right across there and jam the cup into them?
Yep.
But once I got this footage into my video editing software, I was able to slow down certain portions of it and keep other sections sped up faster, like when I jammed the cup into the beans themselves. So that motion was quick, but then immediately ground to a halt as it impacted with the beans on the table. I covered what to do in your video editing software after you've got your footage complete in the video that's on screen and the one I'll link down below. Feel free to ask any questions in the comments section about anything I covered today, and I'll do my best to answer them. Peace.